Nobody knew the quiet woman filing paperwork in the corner office was once the Air Force's most legendary pilot. For 7 years, she stayed silent. Then an F-18 pilot lost both engines at 14,000 feet and screamed one desperate line into the radio, "We need call sign Ghost." What happened next changed everything. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Colonel Marion Hale sat at a small metal desk in the corner of the records office at Kessler Air Force Base. The room smelled of old paper and printer toner. A single window let in a slice of afternoon light that fell across stacks of maintenance logs waiting to be filed. Outside, the sky over the high desert was the flat, endless blue that only shows up in places far from any coastline. Marion was 53 years old. She wore a plain gray cardigan over her uniform, even in summer, and reading glasses that she pushed up on top of her head more often than she wore them properly. To the younger airmen who passed her office, she was simply Ms. Hale, the records clerk who cross-checked flight hour logs and reconciled maintenance paperwork. She had worked in that small office for 7 years. In that time, almost nobody had asked her a single question about her life before Kessler. She preferred it that way. Every morning she arrived before anyone else, made a cup of black coffee in a chipped mug that said "World's Okayest Pilot," a joke gift from a promotion ceremony a decade ago that nobody currently on base would have understood, and worked through her stack of forms in careful, unhurried handwriting. The younger staff thought she was old-fashioned, maybe a little stuck in her ways. They did not know that the same steady hands now filling out requisition forms had once flown faster than sound, inverted, 40 feet above a runway, without blinking. 10 years earlier, Marion Hale had not been a records clerk. She had been Lieutenant Colonel Marion Voss, one of the most decorated test pilots in the Air Force's experimental flight program. She had flown F-16s in her early career, then moved into classified testing work, aircraft whose names never appeared in any public briefing, aircraft that existed for a few years in hangars with no windows before either entering service or disappearing from the record entirely. Her call sign, given to her in flight school and repeated in hushed, half-joking reverence by 2 generations of pilots after her, was Ghost. The name came from a habit, not a mystery. In simulated dogfights, Marion had an uncanny sense for finding the one sliver of angle an opponent couldn't cover. She would vanish from a pursuing pilot's field of view and reappear on their 6 before they understood what had happened. Instructors used to say that flying against her was like fighting fog. You knew something was there. You just couldn't get your hands on it. But her reputation wasn't built on dogfighting alone. It was built on a single, terrible afternoon over the Nevada test range, the kind of afternoon that ends careers and, if you're unlucky, ends lives. She had been flying a prototype aircraft with a flight control system that had passed every simulation and every ground test. Halfway through a high-altitude maneuver, both primary hydraulic systems failed within 4 seconds of each other, a failure mode the engineers later admitted they hadn't modeled, because the odds of it happening had been calculated at somewhere near zero. With no hydraulics, the control surfaces went stiff and sluggish, fighting her at every input. The aircraft, worth more than most people's houses times 1,000, began falling out of the sky in a slow, ugly spiral. She had 30 seconds, maybe less, to make a decision that would define the rest of her life. Below her, barely visible through smoke and dust, was the edge of a small township that had grown up near the test range over the decades, technically inside the restricted zone but never quite evicted. She could eject immediately and let the aircraft crash wherever physics decided to put it. Or she could ride it another few seconds, wrestling every ounce of authority she had left out of a dying flight control system, to bank the nose away from the rooftops and toward the empty scrubland beyond. She chose the second option. By the time she pulled the ejection handle, she was seconds from impact and dangerously low. The parachute barely had time to open before she hit the ground hard, at an angle no body is built to absorb. She broke her back in 2 places and shattered her left hip. The aircraft came down in an empty field exactly where she had aimed it. Doctors told her she was lucky to be alive. They also told her, gently but firmly, that her flying career was over. No more ejection seat aircraft. No more high-G maneuvers. Possibly no more running, if she wasn't careful. She spent 4 months in a hospital bed, then another 8 in physical therapy, learning to walk again with a gait that would never quite be the one she'd had before. The investigation board cleared her of all fault within weeks. The hydraulic failure mode was traced to a manufacturing defect nobody could have caught on a checklist, but the clearance didn't put her back in a cockpit. It only meant that when they took her wings, they did it politely. She remembered the exact afternoon a 2-star general sat across from her hospital bed, thanked her for her service in the careful language reserved for people being managed rather than honored, and asked what she wanted to do next. She had no answer for him. She had wanted, for as long as she could remember, exactly one thing, and that thing had just been taken away by 4 seconds of hydraulic failure over a stretch of Nevada scrubland. The Air Force, in the quiet, bureaucratic way institutions handle people who can no longer do the thing that made them valuable, offered her a desk. She took it without complaint, because the alternative was worse: separation, a pension, a life entirely outside the fence line of a base, surrounded by people who had never once needed to know a call sign. At least behind a desk she could still hear jets taking off in the morning. At least she could still smell jet fuel on the wind some days, faint and sharp, and pretend for half a second that it still had something to do with her. She never corrected anyone who assumed Voss had simply retired somewhere. When she remarried 2 years later, a quiet civil engineer named Daniel Hale, who had never once asked her to talk about the crash unless she brought it up herself, changing her name felt less like a new chapter and more like a door closing behind her, quietly, on purpose. She told herself she didn't miss the sky. For almost 7 years, she nearly believed it. There were nights, though, when she couldn't sleep, when she would sit on the back porch and listen to the far-off engine noise of the night training flights and feel the old ache in her hip flare up in sympathy, as if her body remembered something her mind refused to. That Thursday started like every other Thursday. Marion checked in 3 stacks of maintenance logs. She corrected a misfiled hydraulic inspection report, an old habit, noticing hydraulic paperwork more closely than anyone else in the building ever did, though nobody around her understood why. She drank her coffee. Her assistant, a talkative 24-year-old airman named Rafael Ortiz, ate a granola bar at the next desk and complained cheerfully about the base gym's broken treadmill. Nobody in that small office expected anything unusual. 20 miles away, 4 F-18 Super Hornets from a visiting training squadron were flying a routine formation exercise above a bank of thin cloud, practicing tactical intercepts before a scheduled exercise later that week. It was, on paper, one of the least dangerous flights of the entire training rotation, the kind of sortie junior pilots flew a dozen times a month without incident, logged and forgotten by dinner. Lieutenant Ethan Cole was flying the number 2 position, tucked in tight formation off his flight lead's wing, running through the same intercept geometry he'd practiced 100 times in the simulator and perhaps 30 times for real. He had 11 months of active flying under his belt since graduating flight school near the top of his class, confident in the quiet, slightly restless way young pilots often are before the world has had a chance to remind them how quickly things can go wrong. He had a fiancée back home who worried more than she let on, a dog-eared paperback thriller in his flight bag for the layover nights, and absolutely no reason, that morning, to think today would be any different from the sorties before it. At 2:17 in the afternoon, the emergency channel in Kessler's main control tower erupted. It was not a normal call. It came in on the guard frequency, the one reserved for situations where something has already gone badly wrong. The voice on the radio belonged to a young pilot, and it cracked with the particular, unmistakable strain of someone trying very hard not to sound as frightened as he felt. Kessler Tower, this is Rampage 2-1. I have a dual-engine flameout. Both engines are dead. I say again, both engines are dead. I am in a glide, no thrust, requesting immediate emergency vectors. The tower controller on duty, a second lieutenant named Priya Sood who had been certified only 4 months earlier, felt her stomach drop. She had trained for engine failures in simulators dozens of times. She had never handled a real one, let alone a dual flameout at altitude, where the aircraft becomes, in every meaningful sense, a very expensive glider. Rampage 2-1, Kessler Tower, say altitude and heading. Altitude 16,000. Heading 195. I'm descending fast, I've got partial hydraulics on backup but she's heavy and sluggish. I don't think I can make it back to the field on this heading. Sude's supervisor, a veteran controller named Master Sergeant Boyd, stepped up beside her, watching the radar return sink slowly across the screen. Neither of them said anything for a moment, because there wasn't a procedure that made this simple. A dead-stick landing in a modern fighter is a rare, high-stakes emergency, one most controllers go an entire career without handling, and one most pilots never train for in real conditions, because you can't safely simulate losing both engines at once in an actual jet. In the records office, Raphael had already jumped up from his desk at the sound of raised voices carrying faintly through the wall from the operations building next door. He didn't fully understand what was happening yet, only that something in the air had gone seriously wrong. "Ms. Hale, I think there's an emergency going on. Should I go see if they need extra hands with paperwork or something?" Marion did not look up right away. Her pen, mid-signature on a maintenance form, had gone still. She told herself it was nothing. Pilots declared emergencies sometimes. It happened. It wasn't her business anymore. But her body was already listening in a way her mind wasn't ready to admit. Back in the tower, Lieutenant Cole, the young pilot's full name was Ethan Cole, 26 years old, 11 months out of flight school, was fighting to keep his voice steady as the aircraft sank through 12,000 feet. "Kessler Tower, I need help. I've never flown a real dead-stick approach. I'm losing altitude fast and I don't have a clean picture of my glide numbers for this configuration. Somebody talk me through this." Sude flipped desperately through a laminated emergency checklist, reading off generic guidance about best glide speed and trim settings, none of it tailored to the specific weight, fuel state, or damage this particular aircraft was carrying. It was better than nothing. It was not nearly enough. Then Cole's voice came through again, and this time it wasn't addressed to the tower at all. It was searching for something, someone, specific. "Does anyone at Kessler know the call sign Ghost? My old flight instructor told our whole class, if you're ever in a real dead-stick emergency, get Ghost on the radio if you possibly can. Said Ghost is the only person who ever really understood how to bring a jet down dead stick and make it look easy. Please, I need Ghost. Somebody find Ghost." The tower went quiet for a beat that felt much longer than it was. Sude looked at Boyd. Boyd looked at Sude. Neither of them had ever heard the name before. It sounded like a training legend, something instructors mentioned to scare new pilots into taking emergency procedures seriously, not an actual person who might be standing somewhere on this very base. In the records office, Marion Hale's chair scraped backward hard enough to nearly tip over as she stood. "Ma'am?" Raphael said, startled. "What is it?" She didn't answer him. Something in her face had changed completely, the tired, careful stillness she wore like a second uniform had dropped away, replaced by a sharp, focused clarity that made her look 10 years younger and entirely unlike the woman who'd been quietly correcting hydraulic inspection forms 20 minutes earlier. She walked out of the records office and across the gravel path toward the operations building faster than she had walked in years, ignoring the ache that flared instantly in her hip and lower back. She had trained herself for 7 years not to move like that. Today, apparently, her body had other plans. She pushed through the door into the tower cab. Sude spun around, startled to see an unfamiliar woman in a records office cardigan standing in the middle of an active emergency. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area during an active." "Give me a headset," Marion said. Her voice was calm, but it carried an authority that made Sude's protest die in her throat. Boyd, older and more attuned to old rumors that drift around Air Force bases for years without anyone quite believing them, studied Marion's face for half a second. Something clicked. "Give her the headset," Boyd said quietly. Sude handed it over without further argument. Marion put it on, adjusted the boom mic with the unconscious efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times, and pressed the transmit switch. Her voice, when it came out, was nothing like the quiet clerk's voice from the records office. It was clear, level, and utterly unshaken. Rampage 2-1, this is Ghost. I hear you. There was a pause on the other end, just long enough to register, before Cole's voice came back, flooded with relief so sudden it nearly broke. Ghost, thank God. I've got no engines, altitude 1000, sinking about 1800 feet a minute. I don't have a good handle on my glide ratio in this config. I don't know if I can make the runway. Listen to me, Ethan. She used his first name deliberately, the way she used to with panicked young pilots in training, to pull their focus down out of the noise in their own head. You are not going to panic. Panic is what kills pilots in situations like this, not dead engines. Your aircraft is still flying. It's just flying quietly now. Do you understand me? Yes, ma'am. Good. First thing, trim for best glide. For your weight and configuration, that's going to be around 200 to 210 knots. Get there now and hold it steady. Trimming, speed settling at 205. That's good. Now give me altitude and your best guess at distance to the field. Altitude 10-2. I think I'm about 14 miles out, maybe a little more. Marion closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, running the same rough mental math she used to do without conscious thought. A clean jet in that configuration could manage somewhere around 2.5 to 3 nautical miles of glide for every 1,000 feet, if flown precisely and without a single wasted maneuver. 10,000 feet and 14 miles was tight. Not impossible. But tight, and the margin for error was close to nothing. You're a little short on altitude for that distance, she told him honestly, because false comfort gets pilots killed just as fast as panic does. But it's doable if you fly exactly what I tell you. No hard turns. Every hard turn costs you altitude you will never get back. We're going to make small corrections only. Copy. Copy. Small corrections only. Raphael had followed her from the records office and now stood frozen near the tower door, staring at the woman he thought he knew. Boyd stood a few feet behind Marion, silent, deliberately staying out of her way. Turn left, 5 degrees. Gentle. Report altitude every 1,000 feet. Turning left 5. Passing 9-5. Good. Hold that heading, you're tracking almost dead on for the runway centerline now. Keep your speed pinned at 205. If it drops below 180 you risk a stall you will not recover from at this altitude. Watch it like your life depends on it, because it does. Copy. Watching speed. Now talk to me about your fuel state and cabin indications, quickly, while you've got the bandwidth. Anything unusual before the flameout? Fuel state showed normal right up until it didn't. No warning lights, no vibration, nothing. Just, both of them quit inside a few seconds of each other. I've never heard of that happening on this airframe. File it away, don't dwell on it. Right now the only thing that matters is the next 60 seconds. Everything else is a question for the investigation board, and you are going to be alive to answer it. Boyd, standing just behind her, quietly picked up a second headset and began relaying Marion's altitude calls to base operations and to the fire and rescue crews already rolling trucks toward the runway threshold, a low murmur under Marion's steady voice that nobody in the tower paid much attention to. Soothe had stopped trying to manage the frequency herself and instead stood with her hand hovering near the crash phone, ready the instant it might be needed, watching the older woman work with something close to reverence. The minutes crawled by. Cole's altitude calls came steadily, each one a little lower, each one a little closer to the field, the two numbers, altitude and distance, closing on each other in a race that Marion was tracking silently in her head the entire time. Passing 6,500. Good. 5,800. Hold your line. Then, at just under 5,000 feet, Cole's voice cracked again. Ghost, I don't think I'm going to make it. I think I'm coming up short. You listen to me, Marion said, her voice sharpening without rising. You are going to make this runway. I have put a jet down with no engines before, in worse weather than this, in worse shape than you're in, and I am standing here talking to you right now. You are not going to be a story people tell about a crash. You are going to be a story people tell about a good landing. Do you hear me? A short pause. Then, steadier, yes, ma'am. I hear you. Altitude 4,000. 8 miles out. Hold your speed. Small movements only on that stick. You are flying a glider now, not a fighter jet, and it will punish you for anything sudden. 4,000. 8 miles. Holding. Good. Listen carefully, because you have no power, you get exactly one attempt at this. There is no going around for a second pass. When you have the runway in sight, aim for the very first 100 feet of pavement, not the middle. Every foot you save matters. Copy, aim for the start of the runway. The tower had gone completely silent except for Marion's voice and the short, tense replies coming back through the speaker. Even Sood had stopped moving, watching the slow, small blip on the radar screen sink steadily toward the field. 2,000 feet. I have the runway. I see it dead ahead. Good. Keep your wings level. Don't raise the nose early, let the aircraft settle on its own, trust the glide, trust your training. 1,000. Wings level. 500. Hold steady. Marion's hands were flat and still on the console in front of her, but her knuckles had gone pale from the pressure of holding them so carefully controlled. She remembered this exact silence from 10 years earlier, the way the entire world narrows down to a single strip of pavement and a single decision, over and over, second by second. 200 feet. Runway's right there. Ease the nose up, just slightly, right now. There was a long pause. Then a heavy, screeching sound came through the open channel, tires hitting concrete hard, the long grinding shriek of an aircraft settling onto a runway with no reverse thrust and no engine power to help slow it down. Then, abruptly, silence. Rampage 2-1, do you copy? Marion's voice held, for the first time, a thin thread of real tension. Seconds passed that felt considerably longer than seconds. I'm down, Cole said, breathless. I'm down. I'm on the runway. I'm stopped. I'm okay. The tower cab erupted. Sood let out a shaky laugh of pure relief. Raphael pumped a fist in the air without quite meaning to. Boyd exhaled a long breath he seemed to have been holding for the better part of 10 minutes. Marion simply took the headset off, set it down carefully on the console, and stood still for a moment. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. The adrenaline that had carried her across the gravel path and through the tower door was already draining away, leaving the old, familiar ache in her hip and lower back exactly where it had been before, except sharper now. Boyd stepped up beside her, quieter than she'd ever heard him. Ghost, he said. I heard the name years ago, back when I was stationed at Nellis. Nobody ever confirmed it was real. Didn't believe it, honestly, until about 10 minutes ago. It's Marion now, she said simply. Ghost retired a long time ago. With respect, ma'am, Boyd said, Ghost just landed a jet without leaving this building. Marion didn't answer that. She walked back across the gravel path to the records office, picked up her fallen chair, set it upright, sat back down, and returned to the maintenance log she'd left unfinished, as though nothing at all had happened. Word moved through the base faster than any official memo could have managed. By the end of the day, nearly everyone at Kessler knew that the quiet woman from the records office had once been one of the best emergency pilots the Air Force ever trained. Young airmen who had walked past her office for years without a second glance started finding small reasons to stop by and say hello. She never asked for the attention, and she never gave it much room to grow. A nod. A short answer. Back to work. 2 days later, Lieutenant Ethan Cole came to her office door holding 2 cups of coffee, one of which he set carefully on the corner of her desk. "I don't really know how to thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," Marion said, not looking up from her paperwork. "Check your engines more carefully before your next takeoff, and fly safe." Cole laughed, a little nervously, and nodded. He turned to leave, then paused at the door and looked back. "Ma'am, can I ask you something? Why'd you stop flying, if you were that good?" Marion was quiet for a long moment, her pen resting motionless against the page. "Because even ghosts need to rest sometimes," she said finally. Cole seemed to understand that this was the only answer he was going to get. He nodded once, more to himself than to her, and walked out. Marion turned toward the small window of her office, where a narrow strip of that same flat desert sky was visible above the rooftops across the base. For the first time in 7 years, she didn't look away from it right away. She let herself watch it for a long moment, remembering, before she finally turned back to the quiet stack of paperwork still waiting on her desk. News of the landing traveled well beyond Kessler's front gate within the week. A safety officer who had watched the radar tapes afterward called it, in the driest possible official language, an exceptional example of top-down assistance under emergency conditions, which was about as close as an incident report ever came to admitting that a woman working a records desk had just outperformed every training manual on the shelf. A visiting wing commander asked, half joking, half serious, whether Kessler might consider putting Ghost on the schedule for emergency procedures training. Marion declined, politely, twice, before finally agreeing to sit in on a single afternoon session with a room full of young pilots, on the condition that nobody introduce her by her old call sign. They introduced her by it anyway. She let it go, that one time. Rafael Ortiz, who had spent the better part of a week walking around the records office looking faintly stunned, eventually worked up the nerve to ask her the question everyone on base seemed to be quietly wondering. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, all those years you were filling out forms next to me, complaining about the copier, eating the same turkey sandwich every day, you were thinking about flying that whole time, weren't you?" Marion considered the question longer than he expected her to. "Not thinking about it, exactly," she said finally. "More like carrying it. There's a difference. Thinking about something means you keep going back to look at it. Carrying it means you just keep walking, and it comes along whether you look at it or not." Raphael didn't fully understand what she meant, not that day. It would take him another few years, after a difficult deployment of his own, before her answer would settle into something he actually understood in his bones rather than just his ears. Commander, now effectively her unofficial advocate around the base, Hale, or rather Boyd in this telling, made a quiet request through channels that Marion never asked about and never openly acknowledged, that her original flight records, sealed under the classified test program a decade earlier, be reviewed for a small administrative correction. Nothing dramatic. No parade, no medal ceremony, nothing that would have made Marion visibly uncomfortable in the way medal ceremonies always had. Just a line added to a personnel file, noting that Lieutenant Colonel Marion Voss, later Hale, had continued to serve the mission of flight safety long after her flying status had technically ended. She found out about it by accident, months later, flipping through her own file for an unrelated reason, and said nothing about it to anyone. But she kept a photocopy of that single added line in the top drawer of her desk, underneath a stack of blank requisition forms, where nobody but her would ever think to look. Lieutenant Cole finished out his training rotation at Kessler and returned to his home squadron 3 weeks after the incident, fully cleared to fly. Before he left, he stopped by the records office one final time, not for coffee this time, but simply to say goodbye. "I looked it up," he told her. "The old test program you flew in. Most of it's still classified, but there's enough declassified now that I found your name. Voss. I didn't know a woman flew that program back then. Nobody talks about it." "Most good work doesn't get talked about," Marion said. "That's usually how you know it was actually good work, and not just work that was good at being talked about." Cole smiled at that, The kind of smile of someone filing a piece of advice away for later use, the way young pilots do with the handful of sentences older pilots say to them that actually turn out to matter. "For what it's worth," he said at the door, "my instructor was right. About you being the one to ask for." "Your instructor," Marion said, "was flying training sorties out of Nellis about 9 years ago. Tell him Ghost says hello, and tell him his fuel management was always a little sloppy." Cole laughed, surprised, and didn't ask how she knew. He simply nodded, the way people do when they've decided a mystery is better left as a mystery, and walked out of the office for the last time. Marion sat alone for a while after he left, listening to the ordinary sounds of the base going about its ordinary afternoon, a truck backing up somewhere near the hangars, 2 airmen arguing good-naturedly about a football score, the distant, familiar whine of an engine spooling up on a runway she could no longer see from her window but could still, after all these years, identify by sound alone. She picked up her pen, pulled the next form from the stack, and got back to work. But that evening, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she left her office door open a little longer than usual before heading home, just to listen a while longer to the sound of the sky she had once belonged to, and, in her own quiet way, still did.